Well, welcome to my lecture on Who is a True Christian? The Quest for Religious Identity in Modernity. This is a revised version of a lecture I gave to my Doctor of Ministry students about my book. And what I hope to do in this lecture is kind of summarize some of the key themes and the ideas that I discuss in my book. My work ranges across a wide span of history. I discuss a lot of different texts and a lot of different kind of moments in theological and political, historical existence. And so it's easy to kind of lose sight of some of the strands connecting them together and some of the broader themes and ideas that that kind of all work together to build the larger picture that I'm trying to sketch. So what I hope to do in this lecture is bring those pieces together and hopefully make it an accessible kind of overview of what I discuss in the book. So I want to begin first by just talking a bit about my background for this project. I began my theological studies in missiology. That goes back actually to my undergrad days, where I first encountered Andrew Wall, who was an important figure in the opening chapter of the book. And missiology as a study of mission, the study of really just the translation of Christian ideas across culture, that's where I learned to ask the question, what makes it possible for Christianity to cross from one culture to another? That is a topic that really guided and inspired my earlier work on Bultmann. Rudolf Bultmann, while he is primarily a New Testament scholar, his work, as I read him, is really asking the same missiological question regarding the transcultural or cross-cultural possibility within Christianity. But he's looking at that from a historical angle. How does the Christianity move from an ancient Mediterranean context in the first century to later on to modernity, really, to the overhauls politically, socially, theologically that occur in the modern era. But more recently, I have been working more in the area of politics. I am an editor in political science at the University Press of Kansas, and working in that field has taught me to ask questions about power. How does Christianity move from one context to another? By what mechanisms of power? At whose expense? How does this translation process actually take place in history? Who are the institutions and people, agents involved in that process? And what mechanisms of boundary creation, social construction are operating in that cultural transmission? So having that in view as the background, where my book really begins by asking this question about how do we define Christianity? That question became really salient in the wake of the election of Donald Trump, where a lot of people were asking, are Trump followers true Christians? And of course, this question has been asked 100,000 different times in different contexts, but it became really it exploded really in social media in that period. And my book is an attempt in part to try to weigh in on that conversation and offer, in some ways, a mediation between the different sides on this question. So I use the language of prescriptivism and descriptivism, which I take from the field of linguistics and issues of like dictionary definitions. I'm bringing that conversation, that terminology, into the issue of religious identity. So prescriptivism, as I use it, is a normative definition of religious identity. These are statements like true Christians believe in the triune God, or true Christians are pacifist, or true Christians vote Republican. These kinds of normative statements that define Christianity are abundant. Not just theologians, but people all over the place are making these kinds of claims regularly. So I want to kind of bracket these prescriptivist claims and then distinguish those from descriptivist claims. So descriptivism is a historical account of religious identity, not a normative one. So examples of these might be, Christians globally are located primarily outside of the global north, global west, something like that. Or Christians in the US were the leaders of white supremacy movements and the leaders of civil rights movements. Statements like these are more historical, neutral, so to speak, statements about Christianity. What do Christians, people who claim to be Christian, what are they doing? Where are they living? What are they thinking? What are they writing? Um, so prescriptivism is asking, what should Christians do and believe, and who gets to decide? But this leads to what I call the gerrymandering problem. That's a term taken from other scholars who have talked about this with respect to evangelicalism. Um, and this issue is that the definition constantly shifts to meet the needs of those in power. So you ask somebody in one period of time, what ought Christians to believe and do, and they might change that, a year later when they have to address new issues that then require them, so to speak, to shift the definition to accommodate new problems. So it's a constantly this kind of goalpost shifting issue that makes these definitions inherently unstable. There's also the related problem of the kind of the cowardice of calling people fake Christians. This is a problem that came out with the Trump situation where a lot of progressive Christians, ex-Christians, ex-evangelicals would call people who were supportive of Trump fake Christians. Of course, this went back and forth on both sides. And this is a prescriptivist normative statement. It's an attempt to say that person does not represent Christianity. They are outside the bounds of true Christianity, and therefore Christianity is innocent of their positions. Their actions, their positions don't reflect back on Christianity itself. Christianity remains pure from anything that they are involved with. Descriptivism asks instead, what do Christians do and believe? What are they actually doing on the ground? A question that arises constantly in kind of scholarly discussions about this, or are these descriptions really descriptive, or do they have prescriptive norms of their own that they are presupposing or importing into this conversation? This is a question that arises a lot in discussions about, say, religion. Um, uh, so I touch a little bit on that. That's not a focal point in my book, but I raise that as part of this ongoing question. We have to remain kind of careful and vigilant about recognizing where prescriptive norms are entering into the conversation, even in implicit ways. One of the questions also I raise is, how do we make progress without some kind of prescriptivism? If we remain only with descriptivism, there's not a possibility of addressing injustices, harms done, problems internal to Christianity that require addressing. That involves some kind of prescriptivist activity. So that presents the overall problem of the book, which is how do we do justice to the descriptive reality of Christianity in history, and how do we formulate a prescriptive account of Christianity that that doesn't repeat some of the main errors that we see happening over and over again. This brings me to the bulk of the book, which is my historical overview, kind of my intellectual history of how we construct Christianity. And I introduced early on one of my key ideas, which is this distinction between intellectualism and voluntarism. So to understand this goes back to Plato and Euthyphro's dilemma. So the question that Euthyphro is posing, the text that Plato's text here is a moral ethical one, which is an action good because it is loved by the gods, or do the gods love good action because it is good? Now, this dilemma is meant to show the problem with appealing to divine command or divine volition regarding whether something is good or not. The idea is things are good because they are just rationally understood to be good. Because if it's the former, if it's good because gods love it, then the goodness is completely arbitrary. The gods could love something differently the next day, and that will become good. That eviscerates the idea of goodness. However, it's the latter, then the gods are not the basis of goodness, right? The gods are irrelevant. Goodness is true always and everywhere. So in moral philosophy, the former became known as intellectualism. Sorry, that should be the latter. The latter became known as intellectualism. That it's the goodness is eternal, and the gods love it because it is good. And the former became known as voluntarism. That is, the goodness is what is loved by the gods. So I use this then to then help understand theological claims about Christianity. That is to say, I'm mapping this moral philosophical debate onto kind of doctrinal claims about how do we define Christianity. So theological intellectualism, as I define it, is the idea that something is true and right by definition, and anyone is, in principle, capable of grasping this truth. So, for example, 2 + 2 = 4, not because God or some mathematical authority declared it to be so, but because it simply and eternally is. Justin Martyr here is an example of someone who thought this way about Christianity, this being Justin Martyr. So for him, Christianity did not bring any new doctrines or ideas into the world that conflicted with the truth known always and already to all philosophers. So truth is truth wherever that truth appears in the world. Whoever encounters it and knows it it precedes in Christianity. It is always and everywhere in the world. So Christianity does not have any exclusive claim to the truth. Theological voluntarism, however, is the idea that something is true because someone in authority has willed it to be so. So the truth here is known to those who obey the tradition, who obey that authority. So God is a Trinity, or Christ is 2 natures in 1 person, are viewed as truths in the Orthodox tradition only because the bishops declared them to be so. So here Irenaeus is the patron saint of voluntarism for the way he championed the apostolic tradition over against the Gnostics, whom he regarded as adhering to oral traditions that were separate from what the apostles taught. So the fundamental question that these 2 categories pose, it has to do with continuity. What makes the present continuous with the past? What connects Christians today with Christians yesterday? Intellectualism says that continuity is available to anyone who shares the essence of the faith, regardless of where that essence is found or how it's defined, where it's located. However we think about the essence, that essence is true everywhere. And if you have access to that essence, you are in continuity with the faith. That essence is not limited to Christianity per se. Voluntarism says that continuity is available only to those who are recognized as belonging to the apostolic tradition, however that is understood. So there are a number of differences internal to these different categories, but these 2 types of continuity, 2 types of religious identity, are the different ways of thinking about how Christian identity, or religious identity more generally, how that is understood and how that is passed on or continued throughout history. Voluntarism won the day for Christianity after the Council of Nicaea, in which the Orthodox party used the authority of Constantine to oust their enemies. the ever-increasing complexity of church doctrine required an ever more centralized authority that led to splits between East and West, and of course, further splits beyond that. But in some ways, there's a sense in which voluntarism is a historical inevitability. As an institution becomes more and more complex, has the levels of detail and complexity in the belief system require ever more rigid policing. Something like voluntarism is almost a historical inevitability as a way to manage that complexity. Now, there are different versions of voluntarism, and the bulk of my book is looking at these different accounts and especially how they play out more recently. But we can divide them into these different categories. There's a doctrinal version of voluntarism in which divine truth is found in the set of doctrines that constitute historic Christianity or the apostolic rule of faith. There is a cultural version of voluntarism in which divine truth is found in the culture or worldview or imaginary, whatever term you want to use, of the church. And then there's a political or moral version here where divine truth is found in the moral actions of Christians. And that brings me now to the problem of modernity and how that has affected and reshaped these different accounts of voluntarism. So the problem of modernity is that the modern age is one in which traditional authorities, for example, kings and popes, became subject to critique and rejection, and thus modernity is best understood, I would suggest, as a challenge to voluntarism. Now, while Luther himself was still medieval, his Reformation made much of modernity possible by posing one of the earliest successful challenges to that highest earthly authority. So to follow Charles Taylor here a bit, modernity is the period in which believing otherwise became both possible and acceptable. So it's the period in which one could meaningfully choose what to believe. And in that sense, as Taylor says, modernity is a secular age. This brings us to a round two for the intellectualist and voluntarist debate or battle. So with the traditional authorities becoming open to critique, modernity made space for reopening the possibility of intellectualism. And so I would suggest that liberal theology, in its various guises, is best understood here as a project in a renewed intellectualism. It's an effort to rediscover an essence that is not controlled by the church, but is available in principle to anyone. So that brings me to the term, the essence of Christianity. And this term is, I argue, the liberal version of the ancient term rule of faith. So the rule of faith, or regula fide, is a voluntarist term, whereas essence of Christianity is an intellectualist term. And so I want to kind of walk us through kind of a brief history of the essence of Christianity and the way that it maps onto the different categories, the moral political, the cultural, and the doctrinal. So first I'm going to start off with the moral political. I'm following a broadly historical chronological trajectory here. So first, liberal intellectualism took the form of a universal moral law, a natural morality that could claim to be the unifying connection between religions and cultures. So John Locke's Enlightenment philosophy is an early and influential example of this. Jump forward in time, the moral political essence of Christianity found an especially receptive audience in the United States, where it flourished in the social gospel movement under Walter Rauschenbusch, among many others. And the liberation theology of James Cone and others can be understood as another version of the moral political essence, whereas the social gospel had a primarily class-based focus. Black liberation theology intersectionally added an emphasis on race. And then later, womanist theology added gender and sexuality as well. Now, going back in time here to look at the history here for the rational and doctrinal versions. So Johann Saloma Semler took a more rationalist approach, arguing for a version of the Christian essence rooted in a rational account of what it means to be human. Semler called this new rationalist version of Christianity neology, a kind of a new theology for modernity. The Hegelians historicized that rational essence. So Hegel's philosophy made absolute reason the essence of Christianity and understood this essence to be the fulfillment of history. The likes of Ferdinand Christian Bauer and Adolf von Harnack sought an account of the essence that made sense of Christianity's historical development. So they traced this essence, this rational essence, through its historical permutations. Now switching back to the mystical or cultural essence here. So Friedrich Schleiermacher argued against both rationalist and moralist versions of liberal intellectualism, proposing a more mystical version of the essence that he called the feeling of the infinite, or later the feeling of absolute dependence. So the essence for Schleiermacher was a universal human experience. It's a common sense of our dependence on forces wholly beyond our power to control. So the emphasis on universality here is important to capture what I mean by the intellectualist tradition. I argue that Karl Barth's theology is a version of Schleiermacher's mystical essence, except Barth describes that essence as an eschatological event, the absolutely unknowable inbreaking of God's word into the world. The Christian essence of liberal intellectualism, looking at this in a broad sense, thus divides into three categories. We have the rational version, this is believing, a mystical cultural version, this is the belonging, and the moral political version, or behaving. For each of these modern liberal categories, there is, however, an anti-modern, anti-liberal counterpart. And that brings me to the focal point of my book. So here I'm looking at the new orthodoxies within these three broad categories of believing, belonging, and behaving. And I organize it in this form in this section to capture my argument a little more clearly. So by anti-modern theologies, I'm referring to theologies that are still modern in the sense that they are reacting to the conditions of modernity, but they are self-consciously framed as a rejection and a reaction to liberal intellectualism. They of course, don't use that terminology. That's my own terminology. But that is what they are responding to. They are rejecting the reopening of the possibility of an intellectualist account of Christian identity. Each anti-modern essence is a version of anti-liberal voluntarism. So this is the opposite of liberal intellectualism. And so chapters 2, 3, and 4 of my book look at each of these then in more detail. We have the believing category, which is the quest for historic Christian doctrine. There's the belonging, which is the quest for the Christian cultural worldview. And then there's the behaving, which is the quest for conservative Christian politics. So first, looking at the believing chapter here. So this is looking at historic Christian doctrine. I treat three figures who are kind of exemplify this movement. And the first is, not surprisingly, John Henry Newman. He is, of course, the champion of the rule of faith, a rule that is only known to the church, that serves as the guardian of tradition. Newman was such a proponent of the tradition that he eventually decided that he had to become a Roman Catholic. And he has a famous line that I talk about where he says, "To be deep in history is to cease to be a Protestant." That really captures, in many ways, not only the essence of Newman's own thought, but it exemplifies this whole tradition regarding the historic Christianity or historic Christian doctrine. That whole idea frames this sense in which uh, even if they remain Protestant, there's a sense in which we have to recover something deeper than Protestantism to be responsive to history. Now, Barth is my next example of this essence, of this anti-modern essence. But that, of course, raises a question since I have him also on the modern liberal side. So his presence here is perhaps somewhat confusing or perplexing. And that gets an issue regarding the way Barth was received by his kind of Anglo-American neo-Orthodox interpreters, who really saw Barth as the hero of historic Christianity, the recovery of historic Christianity within 20th century. And this version of Barth, I suggest, is mostly, not entirely, but mostly a creation of this Anglophone reception. And then finally, I look at C.S. Lewis as my third example, mostly because his work had such an influence on evangelicals, and because his Mere Christianity is really, in many ways, a perfect example of a doctrinal account of the essence. Lewis's account of Mere Christianity is reducible to a handful of doctrines that he takes to be shared by all Christians. That's the hallway of Mere Christianity that the other traditions are doors out of. And he claims to be doing something merely descriptive when it is actually quite prescriptive. So his work helpfully exemplifies and it kind of illustrates this complicated interweaving of descriptivism and prescriptivism, the way that these terms and the way these ideas can get used sometimes to mask one's commitments and norms. In the next chapter, I look at belonging, the idea of Christianity as a culture. And so I trace the shift from doctrine to culture as the principal framework for thinking about Christian identity and modernity. That shift takes place over a number of decades in the 20th century in response to various interests and situations that kind of force this to happen. There are a lot ecumenical events like Vatican II here, as well as the Ressourcement and the liturgical renewal movements. These all play important roles in this shift by revealing shared values and shared rights and traditions that supersede doctrinal differences. There's a lot more to be said about the role that these events play. But most of my story looks at the Protestant mainline side, where I trace how they went from having great confidence in biblical theology as the source of a stable Christian identity to eventually abandoning that in favor of a cultural worldview. And so to trace that story, I look at John Mackay at Princeton Seminary, his tenure as president, which saw the formation of Theology Today and other journals where the rise and fall of biblical theology took place. The rise of post-liberalism in the late 20th century then shifts the focus from doctrine and exegesis to culture as the framework for thinking about the essence of Christianity. And that really helped pave the way for the culture war discourse becoming theologically normalized within mainline Protestant discourse. So George Lindbeck and his colleagues at Yale were instrumental in that shift. By the mid-90s, Lindbeck would note that American evangelicals were the ones most likely to carry on his project, and he was correct. That brings us now to behaving and conservative politics. So political identity here is an extension of cultural identity. So once Christianity is defined as a culture, I argue that there are only two options that remain. You can either go the path of separatism in which Christians view themselves as a holy remnant set apart from other cultures. Or you can go the route of imperialism, where Christians take themselves as called to take captive everything in the world and to make it obedient to Christ. These are kind of the two paths that present themselves once you make the cultural turn. Separatism and imperialism are, however, not two cleanly separate tracks. This is an important point. They exist in a dialectic with one another, and many Christians shift from one to the other based on expediency. So this is all related to the question of whether there's one kingdom, inclusive of church and state, or two kingdoms. And Christians often advocate for one kingdom when they have cultural power, and two kingdoms when they do not. The separatist and imperialist paths correspond to two different forms of conservative politics. Christians can view themselves as victims of a war on Christianity that aligns more with the separatist path. Or Christians can view themselves as warriors against political heresy, and that aligns more with the imperialist path. So this chapter of my book looks at both of these accounts, and I trace each of these versions of Christian politics. So since the early 20th century, the idea of Christians as victims of a global war on Christianity has become the new Christian essence within conservative American Christianity. This new identity became prominent with the anti-communist movement when American politicians associated communism with anti-Christian persecution. So Richard Wurmbrand showed his scars in his testimony before the Senate in 1966. He went on to launch the Voice of the Martyrs organization. The idea that there is a global war on Christians has been reinforced by sloppy statistical work, as Jason Bruner has examined in his important work, which I highly recommend. And like Wurmbrand, Paul Marshall built his entire brand and career around this meme, using it to lobby and promote the idea of religious freedom. He is now the Wilson Distinguished Professor of Religious Freedom at Baylor and the Senior Fellow at the Religious Freedom Institute. By making persecution a defining mark of true Christianity, conservative Christians were primed already to see themselves as being in a kind of conservative ecumenical solidarity with so-called canceled persons. So the canceled persons database is today's political version of the Book of Martyrs. It functions symbolically to reinforce the holiness of those who are supposed victims of a sinful world. It also legitimizes their retaliation against that. Paul Marshall forms a transition also to the topic of Christians warring against heresy, since he is also the board chair of the Institute of Religion and Democracy, an organization that has lobbied extensively for right-wing culture war positions around the world. The IRD has been the leading promoter of anti-LGBTQ propaganda in Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe. They're one of many organizations like Citizen Go and others who are also involved in this effort. And conservatives have connected right-wing politics to the rule of faith by framing issues like straight marriage and a fixed gender binary as continuous with historic Christianity, while gay marriage and trans identity are associated with Gnosticism, one of those earliest supposed heresies, the one that Irenaeus was so exercised about. Gnosticism is an almost infinitely flexible heresy that conservative Christians have associated with abortion, IVF, free love, socialism, transhumanism, individualism, etc. This creates a situation in which, politically, a coalition can be formed around Gnosticism around defeating Gnosticism, and whatever political issue arises can be mobilized to support that effort. In any case, what happens in all of this is that Christians are simultaneously viewed as persecuted victims of modern liberalism, and they are righteous warriors commissioned to root out modern liberalism. So we see both aspects of their identity as the separatist version in which they are persecuted and the imperialist version as warriors. These work in tandem as part of their agenda. They can frame themselves as the ultimate victims, the ones who are most suffering from the world, and they can frame themselves as called by God to root out the enemies of Christianity. This brings me to the problem of orthodoxy, which is what I argue is at the root of a lot of these issues, and centrally, is the kind of connective thread connecting all these different versions of modern voluntarism. So I look first at the historical orthodoxy. So the pursuit of historic Christianity is similar to the pursuit of the original America, as in Trump's 1776 report. And I use this as an example just to show and highlight the way that history in the past is used to support an agenda. So both of these are constructions of the past designed to serve a present-day political concern. And we can call that historical orthodoxy. It's an orthodoxy whose boundaries are defined by continuity with the past. The problem with this is that whatever historical moment that we claim to be in continuity with does not exist except in our construction of it, which is in the present. The past does not exist in continuity with one group in the present to the exclusion of another group, unless we reduce history to a principle. So, for example, Trump's commission reduces the USA to the principle of liberty, and then claims to be the sole group in continuity with that original principle. Theologians reduce the New Testament to principles that allow for continuity with Nicaea, between the New Testament and the Council of Nicaea. This happens all the time. I talk a little bit about this in my book, and I trace some examples of that. The post-liberals rightly recognize that doctrinal principles only ever exist in a cultural context. And so they recognize the kind of the intellectual vacuity of the historical orthodoxy framework, and they shifted instead from doctrine to culture as the focal point for orthodoxy. But in doing so, as I've already argued, they made a bad situation much worse. By making a particular culture normative, the post-liberals made culture warring part of Christian orthodoxy, whether that's by retreating into a cult or by imposing themselves on the wider society. And this leads me then to analyze what I call the paradoxes of orthodoxy. So the first paradox of orthodoxy is that orthodoxy distances the community from the past at the same time that it seeks to make the community continuous with the past. So by making the past normative, orthodoxy really cannot let the past remain past, but instead it makes the past into the image of the present. And that thereby distorts the past, making it ever more remote from the community today. So orthodoxy erases the complexity of the past in order to make it continuous with the present. So that's the first paradox. And of course, in each of these paradoxes, you have a violence being enacted. So here, the violence here is against the past itself. By turning the past into the mere image of the present, we do violence to the past, we do violence to history in order to conform it to the image that we need it to be in order to secure our continuity with it. Second, orthodoxy includes as many as possible, while also excluding as many as necessary. So here, orthodoxy is it's navigating this paradox by erasing the complexity of the present. It creates the fiction of a community that is in uniform agreement about certain doctrines and practices. But these doctrines and practices are ambiguous enough, they have to be, to enable orthodoxy to exclude those who may claim to agree with them. So, for example, someone may be in explicit agreement with the stated doctrines and practices that orthodoxy claims are required to be part of the inner circle, but those people might be on the outs. They might be they might need to be ostracized according to the people in power for various other reasons. And so these doctrines and practices have to be framed in an ambiguous enough way to allow the people in power to exclude certain members of the group. And finally, orthodoxy cannot exist without heterodoxy. So here the community constructs orthodoxy by excluding heterodoxy. This is the third form of violence. So the boundaries of orthodoxy cannot be defined by these ambiguous doctrines and practices alone, because even those people the community wants to exclude might claim to agree with them. So ultimately, orthodoxy is instead defined by the exclusion of the people the community wants to reject. If you want to know what a community actually believes, look to those who have been ostracized and excluded from it. So the problem with any definition of orthodoxy is that on its own, it achieves nothing. It only fulfills its task of boundary maintenance when it's activated by a magisterial authority. Orthodoxy requires an authority who is able to wield unilateral power and who determines who is orthodox and who is heterodox. Orthodoxy, in that sense, I argue, requires authoritarianism. So authoritarianism, this fascist tendency, is internal to orthodoxy itself. Orthodoxy requires that tendency. With that, I come to the conclusion of the book where I lay out an alternative. So this is the promise of what I call polydoxy. The idea, this is my vision for a pluralistic Christianity. I'm not going to say a whole lot about that here. The conclusion is merely a suggestive, kind of cursory attempt to point a way forward. But so hopefully this is a project that others, and perhaps myself, can carry on more in the future. So Polydoxy offers an alternative to orthodoxy by providing a framework for thinking about Christian community that does not lend support to authoritarianism. That's the idea. That's the goal of this agenda. Polydoxy has only one Christian essence. It's what the Jewish philosopher Alvin Rines, who coined this term, what he calls the Freedom Covenant. And the Freedom Covenant says that every member possesses an ultimate right to religious self-authority, but at the same time, they have the duty to limit their exercise of freedom within the boundaries set by the freedom of other members. So this is an account of, in some ways, of liberal polity, but it framed in the terms of religious identity. Polydox communities are governed by mutual consent. Those who agree to be part of the community are welcome to be there. Their participation, this is crucial, their participation is not conditional upon the profession of certain beliefs or the carrying out of certain practices or behaviors. Their participation is conditional upon their consent, their willingness to be there. The polydoxy is not a theology or a confession, but it's rather a kind of meta-theology or a meta-confession. It's a structure that allows for multiple beliefs and practices to coexist in a flourishing community. By defining Christianity's norm in terms of religious autonomy, Polydox Christianity unites the descriptive and the prescriptive. So in this case, Christianity is prescriptively what those who consensually exercise their self-authority determine it to be. So to reframe that, so in descriptivism, descriptivism looks at Christians who identify as Christians, what they do. So that's, what Christians with their, consensually exercising their authority, what they determine their own Christianity to be. And I'm arguing that Christianity can be defined prescriptively as this descriptive account of self-authority. So in that sense, Polydox Christianity is essentially, prescriptively, a Christianity always questing for the essence. It is an inherently transgressive faith. The idea here is that these whatever boundaries a person consents to can and will be transcended and transgressed. History continues, history moves on, and people grow, people change, and it is inevitable that we will adopt new ideas, adopt new practices, and change how we understand our faith, how we understand our identity, how we understand the people and the community that we want to be a part of. And so in that sense, Christianity is changing. It always is, and it will always do so, whether we want it to or not. What I'm trying to provide here then is an institutional structural framework for thinking about that change that affirms it and empowers it. Instead of it being something that is antithetical to the tradition, I want to redefine the tradition to embrace precisely that kind of internal change and diversity. All right, thank you very much for listening, and I welcome your feedback and thoughts, and I hope you read the book and let me know what you think of it. Thanks.